at market rates, not at the discounts Venezuela was getting. That money will then be handled in such a way that we will control how it is dispersed in a way that benefits the Venezuelan people, not corruption, not the regime. So we have a lot of leverage to move on the stabilization front. The second phase will be a phase that we call recovery, and that is ensuring that American, Western, and other companies have access to the Venezuelan market in a way that's fair. Also, at the same time, begin to create the process of reconciliation nationally within Venezuela so that the opposition forces can be amnestied and released and from prisons or brought back to the country and begin to rebuild civil society. And then the third phase, of course, will be one of transition. Some of this will overlap. I've described this to them in great detail. We'll have more detail in the days to follow. But we feel like we're moving forward here in a very positive way.
How long will this take, Secretary?
Some senators who were in that briefing describing your operation variously as that you're winging it, that there's no plan for Venezuela going forward.
Yeah, I know. They're going to say that. I used to be a senator too. That's what you always say when it's the other party. The bottom line is we've gone into great detail with them about the planning. We've described it to them. In fact, it's not just winging it. It's not just saying or speculating it's going to happen. It's already happening. Like the oil arrangement that we've made with PDVSA on their sanctioned oil that they can't move. Understand, they are not generating any revenue from their oil right now. They can't move it unless we allow it to move because we have sanctions, because we're enforcing those sanctions. This is tremendous leverage. We are exercising it in a positive way. The President described it last night. Secretary will have more to say on it today, who is involved in running this portfolio. And we feel very positive that not only will that generate revenue that will be used to the benefit of the Venezuelan people, and we're ensured that that's what the case is, but it also gives us an amount of leverage and influence and control over how this process moves forward.
Mr. Secretary, on Denmark, sir. Mr. Secretary, on Denmark. Why has the administration not taken Denmark's offer to discuss the situation in Greenland? And
well, I'll be meeting with them next week.
But will you take military intervention off the table?
I'm not here to talk about Denmark or military intervention. I'll be meeting with them next week. We'll have those conversations with them then. And but I'm not having anything further to add to that today.
Can you clarify your comments to lawmakers? Does the U.S. intend to buy Greenland? Does the U.S. intend to buy Greenland? Can you clarify your comments to lawmakers this week?
Well, that's always been the President's intent from the very beginning. He said it very early on. I mean, this is not new. He talked about it in his first term, and he's not the first U.S. president that has examined or looked at how could we acquire Greenland. There's an interest there. But so I just reminded them of the fact that not only did Truman want to do it, but President Trump's been talking about this since his first term.
The White House put out a statement last night saying that the military option is on the table.
Lost a lot of weight.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. They said the military option is on the table. So is the administration really willing to risk the NATO alliance by potentially moving ahead with military operations?
What I think the White House said yesterday is what I will tell you now, and I've always said. The president always retained the option. Every president, not this president, every president always retains the option. I'm not talking about Greenland. I'm just talking about globally. If the president identifies a threat to the national security of the United States, every president retains the option to address it through military means. As a diplomat, which is what I am now, and what we work on, we always prefer to settle it in different ways. That included in Venezuela. We tried repeatedly to reach an outcome here that did not involve having to go in and grab an indicted drug trafficker. Those were unsuccessful, unfortunately.
The people of Venezuela are waking up to the same regime. Do you not worry about that?
Well, first of all, the bottom line is that there is a process now in place where we have tremendous control and leverage over what those interim authorities are doing and are able to do. But obviously this will be a process of transition. In the end, it will be up to the Venezuelan people to transform their country. We are prepared under the right conditions, using the leverage that we have, which includes the fact that they cannot move any oil unless we allow them to move it to... Well, again, I'm not going to give you a timeline on it. We wanted to move as soon as possible. But we didn't expect this would... It's been 3 days since this happened, 4 days since this happened. So I understand that in this cycle and society we now live in, everyone wants instant outcomes. They want it to happen overnight. It's not going to work that way. But we're already seeing progress. With this new deal that's been announced and more deals to follow, you're already seeing how the leverage the United States has over those interim authorities is going to begin to lead to positive outcomes.
This has cost American taxpayers. How long should the American public...
It doesn't cost us...
The U.S. involvement in Venezuela, how much will it cost you?
Well, it isn't going to cost us any money. For example, this oil deal that's happening doesn't cost us any money. On the contrary. And if it opens up...
No money to
well,
look,
I don't have the numbers. What operation are you talking about? The entire thing?
Yeah.
Well, these troops are going to be deployed. None of these troops sit in a dry dock waiting for action. They're deployed somewhere in the world. If they're not here, they're somewhere else. Just today, our forces not deployed to the Caribbean seized a boat, a sanctioned boat tied to the IRGC that tried to flee from us. That happens somewhere else. We are constantly involved in action. We have boats in the Mediterranean. We have ships in the Middle East. We have ships in the Indo-Pacific. These ships, if they weren't in the Caribbean, they'd be somewhere else conducting activity. Yeah. That's what the Navy does.
Yeah. No, I want to emphasize that. Question from CNN. The question's never asked how much does it cost when they're in the Mediterranean or the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. But now that they're in our hemisphere, on a counter-cartel mission or ensuring that an indicted individual comes to justice, now you're asking the question of cost. It's a disingenuous question to begin with. You're trying to find any angle possible to undermine the success of one of the most historic military missions the world has ever seen. The level of sophistication that Senate just was briefed on, and the House was briefed on, a classified level, is something only the United States of America can accomplish. The world is taking notice of that. Certainly Venezuela is taking notice of that. And it continues because 2 oil tankers, 2 overnight, were seized by the United States of America, stateless or sanctioned, because the oil blockade, the quarantine of oil out of unsanctioned or stateless, sanctioned or stateless vessels continues. That leverage will continue as Secretary Rubio outlined. So our military is prepared to continue this. As he said, the president, when he speaks, he means it. He's not messing around. We are an administration of action to advance our interests, and that is on full display. We're happy to brief the House and the Senate.
No. 2 quick things. Okay, number one, because we have to go, because we got to brief the House, and if we don't and they're pissed at us, you guys better defend us. That was because we were talking to you. I would make one more point, and it's a very interesting point. One of those ships that was seized that had oil in the Caribbean, you know what the interim authorities are asking for in Venezuela? They want that oil that was seized to be part of this deal. They understand that the only way they can move oil and generate revenue and not have economic collapse is if they cooperate and work with the United States, and that's what we see are going to happen. We got to go talk to the House, guys. I apologize.
Will you testify publicly?
Is it a challenge to Vladimir Putin? That was a Russian-flagged tanker.
Okay, we've been listening in here on CBC News Network as U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and also the Secretary of War Pete Hegseth spoke with reporters there. A number of things to go through. I'd like to start here with some of those remarks on Greenland. Marco Rubio saying there that next week he will be meeting with, it sounded like, Danish officials. Just yesterday, Denmark's foreign minister said that they were formally requesting a meeting with Marco Rubio due to some of those threats and increased rhetoric that we've heard from Donald Trump and senior members of that administration showing interest in possibly annexing Greenland. So that was a little bit of what we heard on that front, that yes, they do intend to meet. Also was asked about that post, talking about possible military action. That was a statement that had come from the White House saying that that was not off the table. Marco Rubio saying that he was speaking about this in a general sense, that a military option is always on the table for a U.S. president, regardless of which world issue you may be speaking about, but not sort of directly addressing that statement from the White House from yesterday in the context of what has been unfolding in Greenland. We also heard him there taking questions on Venezuela. He outlined what he called a 3-step plan for that country. He said it will start by stabilizing the country, taking oil that had been quarantined or sanctioned. We know that that was already announced a little bit earlier on, that there will be millions of barrels of oil making its way to the United States. According to Rubio, the proceeds would then in some sort of way be used to benefit the Venezuelan people and not the regime. That is what we heard from Rubio. He also talked about a recovery step and then eventually a transition as well. So in terms of more details here, that's sort of the latest that we've heard on the U.S. administration's plans for Venezuela. We will have much more news straight ahead for you. You are watching CBC News Network.
for Trump to turn around and make statements like that is a shock.
The Trump administration isn't ruling out using the U.S. military to acquire Greenland. A statement from the White House confirms that Trump is considering a range of options to gain access to the territory, including military force. It's the most aggressive rhetoric on Greenland yet from this White House. Just moments ago, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said he will be meeting with Danish officials next week. So what do Greenlanders think of possibly being taken over by the U.S.? Well, as you would expect, the responses are wide-ranging. The leader of Greenland's opposition party says he is open to talks with the Trump administration. Here are some of his conversation with Power and Politics host David Cochrane.
I think we are looking at it a little bit differently than most other countries are doing, because you have to remember this isn't new. This started in 2019. Where Trump wanted to buy Greenland. He kind of figured out immediately that that couldn't be the case. But in the second round here, I think most people are too eager to put words in his mouth and actually interpret what he's saying instead of listening to him. Because people tend to forget that we actually signed an agreement with the U.S. in 2020 saying that we are vital for the defense of the U.S. continent. So basically, he's not saying anything we haven't signed with the U.S. already. But what people are putting into it is completely different. And that's where you see this fear-mongering, this panic of what is he going to do? Well, if you look at the latest he has said, along with what his special envoy has said, is that what they're actually talking about is empowering the Greenlandic people and offering, for instance, a free association forum, which means independence from Denmark for Greenland. That doesn't mean we should belong to the US, but again, it's a big difference between what the press is focusing on and what we are hearing.
Okay, but did you hear what his Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, had to say yesterday? He said it's their view that Greenland should belong to the U.S. He said nobody is going to fight the U.S. militarily over the future of Greenland. Mm-hmm. And then he said we live in a world, in the real world, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. And these are the iron laws of the world since the beginning of time. That sure sounds like more than just an association. That sounds like annexation.
Well, if we want to promote him to President of the United States, then I have to say, well, the day before that, it was his wife that somebody promoted to the President of the United States. He is not, and neither is his wife. So let's dial down the rhetoric. And one of the important things you have to remember is that everybody seems so keen on talking about the annexation from the U.S. as a threat, completely ignoring that we have been annexed by Denmark. And that's why we're trying to get independence as well. So I don't see how the world society is trying to uphold the international rule-based world when they at the same time disregard how Denmark annexed Greenland in the first.
Okay, the leader of Greenland's opposition party adds that he has no interest in making an enemy out of the U.S. Well, Calgary City Council will hold a special meeting today to discuss an independent review of a massive water main break, not the ongoing breach from last week, but a previous rupture on the same pipe just 2 years ago. Of critical interest, the part about how a similar problem could be avoided in the future. We'll have details ahead on CBC News Network. Calgary City Council is set to hold a special council meeting today to publicly discuss an independent review of a catastrophic water main break in 2024. It's happening as the city grapples with another massive burst along the very same pipe. The 600-page report about what caused the failure 2 years ago was first presented to City Council last month. However, it was criticized by some for not offering a clearer answer on how to stop it from happening again. A water main break last week caused significant flooding in a northwest neighborhood. The mayor says he'll be looking to see what steps from the latest report can be applied to quickly procure a replacement pipe. Meanwhile, communities around Calgary are doing what they can to save water. The CBC's Terry Trembath explains.
The city of Calgary is urging people to cut back on water usage right now. But that plea for shorter showers and fewer flushes is not just for Calgarians. Tsuut'ina Nation, Airdrie, Strathmore, and Chestermere all depend on Calgary for their water supply. Chestermere's deputy mayor says his community is doing their part to cut back.
Very little pushback. Yes, it does affect people's quality of life. You know, you got to take 3-minute showers. I don't know how you do that, but people are managing. It's trying to manage with these challenges. It's not the first time we've been faced with this. And I don't know if it'll be lost.
Chestermere's drinking water comes from the East Calgary Regional Water Line. Narayan says Calgary's poor infrastructure health is a concern. Securing their own water source is not an option at this point.
One of the biggest challenges would be getting water license. There are quite few and far between. And even if we were to get water license to build a water treatment plant and to run pipes all the way to Bull River, it's quite cost prohibitive.
Strathmore spent tens of millions to get their water from Calgary. They switched water sources from the Western Irrigation District in 2010 and built a water reservoir for storage. Their mayor says they are already working on expanding that.
As we look to the future, our engineering team and our CAO and his senior leadership team have already got a long-term plan as to where and when we're going to have to start looking at having another water reservoir.
Airdrie gets its supply from 3 Calgary feeder mains. Their mayor says not only have they already spent $100 million on a new wastewater line from Calgary, alternatives like tapping into Crossfield system to the north wouldn't be strong enough anyway.
If we were to tap into their water source, which I believe comes from the Red Deer system, they're kind of the end of the line of that system, and their population's significantly lower, so if we tried to tap into that, we would get the pressure of a garden hose.
For now, the mayors say the best option is to stick to following restrictions and work with Calgary on future solutions. Terry Trembath, CBC News, Strathmore.
A water plant failure is forcing the Kashechewan First Nation in Northern Ontario to soon begin evacuating community members from their homes. The chief declared a state of local emergency on Sunday due to the poor condition of the water treatment plant. About 2,300 people live on the First Nation. The chief says the timeline for repair is unclear. We have an update on a tragedy in southwest Nova Scotia last weekend. A 13-year-old boy attacked by 3 large dogs on Saturday died of his injuries yesterday. His community is mourning his death and also reaching out to help the boy's family. The CBC's Brett Ruskin has more from Halifax.
Happening right now, a surge of support in the South Shore of Nova Scotia for a family that's going through heartache and tragedy. It all began on Saturday evening around 5 p.m. 13-year-old Drew Nickerson was riding his bike down a back road, a dirt road, when he was attacked by 3 dogs. Now, we don't know the circumstances before, during, or after the attack, but we know that he was transported via life flight helicopter here to Halifax. Doctors tried to save him, but 2 days after the attack, he died in hospital. Now, there again, I mentioned the surge of support. There has been a GoFundMe campaign started for the mother of Drew Nickerson, who's been off work during this time. There's also local fishing crews, individuals and companies coming forward to offer items for a raffle. So boxes of seafood. There was individuals, photographers who said that they would offer a photo package. There was local breweries that were offering gift cards. Each of these items to be raffled off with the proceeds, again, going to the family of Drew Nickerson. As for the dogs, the RCMP say that they were 3 large breed dogs, but didn't specify exactly what breed of dogs they were. No charges as of yet laid against the owners of the dogs, although RCMP say that the investigation is still ongoing. And as for the dogs themselves, they have now been euthanized by a local veterinarian. Still lots of questions swirling around if these dogs were loose out in the yard, if they somehow got out, what was happening before the attack, or if this has ever happened before. Even once we get those answers, it's still not going to relieve or ease any of the heartache being experienced by the family and this close, tight-knit community as a result of this sudden, dramatic tragedy on Nova Scotia's South Shore. Brett Ruskin, CBC News, Halifax.
Well, earlier today, Toronto police gave an update on a shooting last month at a University of Toronto campus that left 1 person dead. The incident happened 2 days before Christmas when a 20-year-old international student was shot and killed. It marked Toronto's 40th homicide of the year. Here's some of that update from police.
An arrest has now been made in the murder of 20-year-old Shavank Avasti. On December 23rd, at approximately 3:30 p.m., officers responded to reports of a person with serious injuries on the Highland Creek Trail located on the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. When officers arrived, they located a 20-year-old male who had been shot. He was pronounced deceased at the scene.
Police have charged the 28-year-old suspect with first-degree murder. Authorities believe the incident was a random act of violence. Well, here's a live view for you coming from Kulusuk in Greenland. The United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio says he'll be meeting with Denmark and Greenland next week. The U.S. has been discussing potential plans to acquire Greenland, a semi-autonomous region of Denmark. The U.S. said they're considering using the military for their venture. That, of course, has drawn much criticism from world leaders, including those in Europe and the Danish Prime Minister. You are watching CBC News Network. We have much more news for you coming up straight ahead.
through strength foreign policy agenda. So we're continuing to be in close coordination with the interim authorities, and their decisions are going to continue to be dictated by the United States of America.
Just one follow-up, when you talk about that leverage there, has the Venezuelan government fully committed to turning over its oil to the United States indefinitely, and what happens if they do not?
Well, as you saw, the president announced last night, this was a deal. This was a deal made by the president and his team with the Venezuelan interim authorities. This will benefit both the American people and the Venezuelan people. And Secretary Wright and the Department of Energy are working with the interim authorities and also with the private oil industry to execute on this historic energy deal. That's not only good for the United States, but it's also going to revive the prosperity, the safety, the security of both the United States and Venezuela as well. Ed.
Following up on the oil part of this, the 30 to 50 million barrels of oil, how exactly is that going to work? You're getting it out of Venezuela into the United States?
Yes.
And then what?
That's exactly right. So as you know, Ed, as the president announced last night, this was the sanctioned oil that was basically just sitting in barrels, sitting on ships because of the effective quarantine of the United States of America. And the interim authorities have agreed to release that oil to the United States, so it will be arriving here at home very soon. The United States government has already begun marketing Venezuelan crude oil in the global marketplace for the benefit of the United States, engaged the world's leading commodity marketers, key banks to execute and provide financial support for these crude oil and crude product sales. All proceeds from the sale of Venezuelan crude oil and products will first settle in U.S.-controlled accounts at globally recognized banks to guarantee the legitimacy and integrity of the ultimate distribution of proceeds, and those funds will be dispersed for the benefit of the American people and the Venezuelan people at the discretion of the United States government.
It sounds like it requires a lot of private sector engagement and agreement
And
from the oil industry and the banking industry.
That's
Do you
right.
have that yet?
There's a lot of private sector engagement that's happening right now. As you know, Secretary Wright, our energy secretary who's heading up this big project, is in Florida today meeting with some of these oil executives. And as we confirmed earlier, they will also be at the White House later this week. So they are absolutely eager to invest. They're eager about these opportunities. And Secretary Wright is a very well knowledgeable guy when it comes to oil and energy, and he's the perfect man for the job.
Another corner of the world, real quick on Iran.
Go ahead.
So just to follow up on the oil, 30 to 50 million barrels is an initial tranche, if you will, and then what happens after that? What
I won't get ahead of the plans that the president and his team are currently speaking with the interim authorities about, but rest assured, there is a long-term plan here. Secretary Rubio and the entire team are working diligently on it, and this is just sort of the first action that you all are seeing. Ed.
Thanks, Caroline. So in order to get these oil companies to invest billions in Venezuela, how will the U.S. reassure that their workers will be safe in Venezuela? Could there be troops involved?
At this point in time, as you know, there are no troops on the ground in Venezuela. The president, of course, reserves the right to use the United States military if necessary. It's not something he wants to do. Diplomacy is always the first option. As you saw, he tried that with Nicolás Maduro, but unfortunately, he was an illegitimate dictator and an unserious person. And so President Trump authorized this law enforcement operation, and now Nicolás Maduro is sitting in a prison cell in New York. So certainly the president is going to do what's in the best interests of the American people, and that includes workers from our energy and oil industry as well.
With that meeting tomorrow, what is the message the president is going to give to the oil executives, and what does he want to hear?
Well, the meeting is on Friday, and it's just a meeting to discuss, obviously, the immense opportunity that is before these oil companies right now. Stephen.
Thank you, Caroline, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
The New Yorker had a story yesterday on the vice president, and it questioned his, quote, notable absence on Venezuela. And the sub-headline asked, was the vice president's exclusion from the operation in Venezuela an expression of his anti-interventionist ideology or political calculation? Would you be able to discuss the vice president's role in Venezuela policy?
I did see that report in the New Yorker, and quite frankly, I laughed out loud because it's very clear it's a fake report that's trying to sow distrust and division amongst the president and his team. Let me just be very clear. The vice president has been involved in all policy. He is the right-hand man of the president on all policy matters, including Venezuela policy. He was, of course, read in and deeply involved in this operation from the very beginning. And he was present on the night of the operation via secure communication at a different location as to not damage the operational secrecy of this mission. That was so incredibly important to ensure that this mission could be carried out successfully without endangering our troops. Sure.
The U.S. seized a tanker recently. Russia specifically asked the United States not to seize that tanker. Does this action risk a larger conflict with Russia?
I believe you're referring to the Bella 1 tanker that was seized this morning. The Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, in coordination with the Department of War, did announce that seizure this morning for violations of U.S. sanctions. I've spoken about the enforcement of our sanctions policy at the podium prior to the new year, and this administration is going to fully enforce the sanction policy of the United States. The vessel this morning was seized in the North Atlantic pursuant to a warrant issued by a U.S. federal court after being tracked, and this was a Venezuelan shadow fleet vessel that has transported sanctioned oil, and the United States of America, under this president, is not going to tolerate that. I would also just add the vessel had a judicial seizure order, and the crew, so that means the crew is now subject to prosecution for any applicable violation of federal law, and they will be brought to the United States for such prosecution if necessary. Kelly.
Karoline, Happy New Year to you.
Thank you. You too.
I'd like to talk to you about a couple of things real quickly. The first question about the Venezuelan people. As you know, there's some 8 million Venezuelans here, some of them celebrating in the streets. There are Venezuelans on the ground who are concerned about their safety. What does the Trump administration, what is it doing to actually help people in Venezuela understand that they will be secure throughout this transition?
I think the fact that this president actually followed through on the long-held promise of the United States of America, the bipartisan promise to take down the illegitimate Maduro regime, should give assurance to the Venezuelan people and also Venezuelan Americans who fled this communist regime for a better life here at home, that this is a president who is serious about taking down illegitimate regimes and who is also serious about securing the security of the United States of America, including the Venezuelan American people. And I would just add that this is something that not just Republicans and President Trump have talked about for a very long time, but it is also something that Democrats have advocated for. In 2020, Chuck Schumer said that that at the time, President Trump had not brought an end to the Maduro regime. The Maduro regime is more powerful today and more entrenched today than it was when the president began. Now you hear Chuck Schumer out there saying this is reckless. The American people and the Venezuelan people should be in fear. But this is something that Chuck Schumer has long advocated for. Senator Chris Van Hollen, same thing, had said that the United States is going to use its leverage and influence to push for negotiations to transition to the truly elected leader. This was under President Biden. We know Maduro and his cronies don't want to go quietly into the night. The U.S. needs to work to ratchet up the pressure. Now, Senator Holland says it's an illegal act of war to get rid of Nicolás Maduro. So the hypocrisy is really astounding here, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to point it out, Kayla. I mean, sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
So there are reports that the administration is demanding that Venezuela cut ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. Can you confirm?
I'm sorry?
Reports that the administration has essentially demanded that Venezuela cut ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. Can you confirm that?
Well, those alleged demands were made in a classified briefing by Secretary Rubio, and I know that there's a lot of leaks coming out of these classified briefings, so I'm not going to confirm or deny or get into what the Secretary has said in classified settings to members of Congress. But I think that the administration has made it quite clear to the interim authorities in Venezuela that this is the Western Hemisphere, and American dominance is going to continue under this president.
If I could just ask, there have also been reports that the U.S. could potentially buy Greenland as one potential option on the table. What would such an offer look like? Is there anything monetarily you could provide, any details there?
Well, that's something that's currently being actively discussed by the president and his national security team. And I would point out that the acquisition of Greenland by the United States is not a new idea. This is something that presidents dating back to the 1800s have said is advantageous for America's national security. The president has been very open and clear with all of you and with the world that he views it in the best interest of the United States to deter Russian and Chinese aggression in the Arctic region. And so that's why his team is currently talking about what a potential purchase would look like.
Karoline.
Jackie.
Karoline, just following up on Greenland, why not rule out taking it by military force?
I know that past presidents and past leaders have often ruled things out. They've often been very open about ruling things in and basically broadcasting their foreign policy strategy to the rest of the world, not just to our allies, but most egregiously to our adversaries. That's not something this president does. All options are always on the table for President Trump as he examines what's in the best interests of the United States. But I will just say that the president's first option always has been diplomacy. Again, look at Venezuela. He tried ardently to strike a good deal with Nicolás Maduro, and he told him, I will use the United States military and you will not like it if you don't take such a deal. And look at what happened. With respect to Iran, the president said the same thing, right? He tried to have serious interest in a deal with the Iranian regime with respect to their nuclear capabilities. They were not interested, and so Operation Midnight Hammer happened, which was another remarkable military success under the leadership of this commander-in-chief. So the president keeps his options open, but diplomacy is always the first.
Quickly, just one additional follow-up on that. Does the president recognize Denmark's ownership as part of the kingdom? Because there have been some Republican senators questioning, the claim that Denmark has to Greenland. Is the president in that camp with them, questioning the legality of
I have not heard him question it personally, but you're welcome to ask him yourself next time you have the chance.
Sanctions are being lifted for Venezuela. We got to lift some sanctions to let the oil come in. Can you talk about that just very briefly?
Yes, so the U.S. is selectively rolling back sanctions to enable the transport and the sale of Venezuelan crude and oil products to the global markets, yes.
Karoline.
Annie.
Thank you. There are some reports from Venezuela that the country's leaders are cracking down on the population, specifically suppressing public expression of support for Maduro's ouster. Is that kind of behavior consistent with what the president wants to see, how the president wants to see the leaders take on the population?
It would not be consistent, and I'll let the president's national security team speak further on that. I know they are well aware and tracking. Kelly.
Two questions. One, on the seized vessels, the Bella, the Sophia, can you tell us where they're headed, what happens to any existing cargo, and you reference personnel but potentially facing prosecution? That's one thing I'd like to follow on. And then
on the Bella.
Yes, okay. And on Annie's question, if I could also ask, does the administration believe that the interim regime should release all political dissidents and prisoners and return detained Americans?
That's not a question that I've personally spoken about to the president with, so I will let him answer that question. I don't want to make new policy at this podium today with respect to Venezuela. With respect to the two ships that you mentioned, I spoke with you about the Bella 1. There was another vessel this morning, the Sophia, that in coordination with the Department of War, the Department of Homeland Security apprehended it. This is a stateless, sanctioned, dark fleet motor tanker, and this occurred without incident. This vessel was operating in international waters and conducting illicit activities in the Caribbean Sea. The U.S. Coast Guard is escorting the Sophia to the United States for final disposition. To answer your question, Kelly, directly, this was through Operation Southern Spear. The Department of War is unwavering in its mission to crush illicit activity in the Western Hemisphere. And as the President has repeatedly stated, we're going to defend our homeland and restore security and strength across the Americas. Dasha, go.
Caroline, thank you and Happy New Year.
Thanks, you too.
Two questions, one on Venezuela, one on Greenland. You've repeatedly at the podium called the current leadership in Venezuela interim leadership. There are Republicans and Democrats alike that say they want to see elections in Venezuela. The president had said it's too soon to do that right now, but is there a timeline for elections in Venezuela? Is he committed to seeing that this year, for example?
You just said the president has answered that question, so I will reiterate what the president has said a few times now to all of you, which is that it's too premature and too early to dictate a timetable for elections in Venezuela right now.
Caroline, you just talked to Jackie about diplomacy first, right? The Danes have repeatedly said they are willing to collaborate on all of the concerns that the president has, whether it's more troops, mineral rights, intelligence sharing. Why does the president feel he needs to own Greenland and not and put out the threat of military action when this could be done through diplomacy?
Well, who said diplomacy isn't taking place behind the scenes, Dasha? I mean, the president is interested in diplomacy. His national security team is as well. And of course, he's always willing to pick up the phone for everybody and hear out their concerns. But the president is the president of the United States of America, and he's always going to be very clear about what he views as being in our nation's best interest. Reagan.
Karoline. I have a question for you on Venezuela, and then I'd love to ask you about Minnesota and Tim Walz.
Sure.
On Venezuela, I'm wondering, does the administration hope to start sending more Venezuelan migrants back home or have them self-deport if the situation in the country improves?
As far as I'm concerned, the policies of the Trump administration and the Department of Homeland Security have not changed. All those illegally present in the country are subject to deportation. And I would just like to add, how we got here. The president was very clear on the campaign to the American public, and it's one of the many reasons they resoundingly reelected him back to this office, that he was not only going to crush foreign drug cartels, but that he was not going to stand by and watch as the illegitimate Venezuelan regime was sending illegal criminals and gang members and rapists and murderers to our country, which happened to the tune of thousands under the previous administration and president. And so there could be nothing more America first than this operation that took place last week. And I would just remind all of you in this room that there were innocent Americans like Jocelyn Nungare who lost their lives at the hands of dangerous Venezuelan criminals who were sent here by the Maduro regime. And that has been the president's North Star and guiding principle throughout his entire policy since January 20th.
Tim Walz in Minnesota. Does the administration believe that Tim Walz potentially dropped out of the governor's race because he could be under criminal investigation?
I don't know if there's a criminal investigation. If there was, I wouldn't be able to comment on it from up here, to be honest with you. But I think Tim Walz probably dropped out of the race because he realizes he no longer has the support of the people of his own state, which is a remarkable downfall considering he was the #2 on the Democrat Party's ticket just about a year ago. When it comes to Minnesota, the fraud that we have seen, the wide scale of fraud is really remarkable. It's egregious. I would encourage every single journalist in this room to go to Minnesota and to cover it yourselves. As for the Trump administration, we have officials who have been on the ground almost every day. Secretary Noem was there yesterday. Secretary Bessent will be traveling there later this week to talk about the fraud and to do a roundtable on this very topic. And I would just like to leave you with an update. To date, the Department of Justice has charged 98 total defendants in several Medicaid fraud and related case programs. 64 were convicted, and 85 of the 98 charged were of Somali descent. The DOJ has also issued over 1,700 subpoenas, executed over 130 search warrants, and they have now added more attorneys to their office there to absorb the case flow. DHS is on the ground going door to door conducting large-scale criminal and HSI investigations. They have also sent approximately 2,000 agents to Minneapolis to assist with law enforcement and immigration enforcement. As I said, Secretary Noem was on the ground yesterday. The Department of Health and Human Services has also begun requiring a justification and photo evidence for all child care related payments nationwide, and they required Minnesota to conduct a full audit of all child care centers. They also froze $185 million in funding to Minnesota. And Dr. Oz, who was just here, also notified Governor Walz they're going to begin auditing Medicaid recipients and deferring payments on claims based on waste, fraud, and abuse. The Department of Labor is also conducting a targeted review of Minnesota's unemployment program. Department of Agriculture requiring Minnesota to conduct recertification for SNAP recipients, and HUD has launched investigations into the public housing. SBA has also suspended nearly 7,000 borrowers amid suspected fraudulent activity. So, with all of that, rest assured this is an all-hands-on-deck effort from the entire administration to get to the bottom of this and to ensure that the ripping off of taxpayers in the state of Minnesota, and it won't just be Minnesota, it'll be any state across this country where fraud has taken place, and we are protecting law-abiding, tax-paying American citizens. Phil.
We have been listening in here on CBC News Network to White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt taking questions from reporters on a number of topics. We heard her talking about those 2 oil tankers, which the U.S. has seized today, saying that this is the Western Hemisphere and U.S. dominance is going to continue under Trump. She also spoke about the ongoing situation with Donald Trump's hopes to annex or somehow take control of Greenland. She did say that diplomacy is always the president's preferred option. We'll speak more about that in just a minute. But we do want to start here with Venezuela, because there were numerous comments there about Venezuela, about what is going to happen to Venezuelan oil and what is going to come next. The CBC's Willie Lowry was also listening in to Karoline Leavitt, and he joins us now from our bureau in Washington. So, Willie, thank you for being here. Take us through what we just heard from the White House on Venezuela.
Yeah, Hillary, as is so often the case with these press conferences, a very wide-ranging and fairly long event. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt took a host of questions on Venezuela. She vociferously defended the president's decision to go in and seize Nicolás Maduro. She said that no other president in history, no other military in history or around the world would have been capable of what the U.S. pulled off. She also spoke a little bit about what's going to happen with some of the oil that the U.S. has seized. They expect somewhere around 30 to 50 million barrels of oil to essentially be in U.S. custody, and that the U.S. was already working to get that oil to market. She also painted a little bit of a picture of what she described as the future of Venezuela. That is something that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio also spoke about just before Leavitt started speaking. He was speaking outside at the Capitol building, and he outlined a three-phase scenario for the country. Let's take a listen.
Step one is the stabilization of the country. We don't want it descending into chaos. Part of that stabilization, and the reason why we understand and believe that we have the strongest leverage possible, is our quarantine. As you've seen today, 2 more ships were seized. We are in the midst right now, and in fact about to execute on a deal to take all the oil. They have oil that is stuck in Venezuela. They can't move it because of our quarantine and because it's sanctioned. We are going to take between 30 and 50 million barrels of oil. We're going to sell it in the marketplace at market rates, not at the discounts Venezuela was getting. That money will then be handled in such a way that we will control how it is dispersed in a way that benefits the Venezuelan people, not corruption, not the regime. So we have a lot of leverage to move on the stabilization front.
The final phase that the U.S. envisions is one of transition. Karoline Leavitt described the Venezuelan government currently as the interim government. Of course, that suggests that they have plans for what a future Venezuelan government might look like. They did not offer any timeline, though, on what that transition period might look or when it would come into effect.
And Willie, of course, the other major topic that we heard Karoline Leavitt address there was Greenland and these threats coming from Donald Trump and some of his more senior advisors towards it. She seemed to stress that the president is interested in diplomacy, but then, of course, there were all those questions about, well, if that's the case, why would you threaten them with possible military action?
Yeah, absolutely. The administration is not backing down, clearly, when it comes to Greenland. And as you said, she said that the president's first option was always diplomacy, but one of the reasons why they continuously say or articulate that all options are on the table, including the military option, is because they don't want to telegraph to adversaries or even, I guess, allies that the military would not be an option. I suppose they don't want to handcuff themselves before or unnecessarily. Again, this is something that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke about as well. Let's take a listen to what he had to say. He had an interesting exchange with reporters on the Hill.
Does the U.S. intend to buy Greenland? Can you clarify your comments to lawmakers this week?
Well, that's always been the president's intent from the very beginning. He said it very early on. I mean, this is not new. He talked about it in his first term, and he's not the first U.S. president that has examined or looked at how could we acquire Greenland. There's an interest there. But so I just reminded them of the fact that not only did Truman want to do it, but President Trump's been talking about this since his first term.
And Rubio referred to it there, and it's something that Leavitt also stressed, that this has been a long-held ambition of the president's and that he is not alone, that other presidents have also been interested in acquiring Greenland.
Okay, Willie, thank you for all of this, for breaking it down for us. We do appreciate it. The CBC's Willie Lowry in Washington. Let's go back now to Venezuela and its uncertain future. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke just a short time ago, as we were just hearing there, and he presented 3 points as the basis for the country's next chapter. For more on this, we've reached Douglas Farah in Washington. He is the president of IBI Consultants. It's a national security firm. He has also advised the Pentagon from 2012 to 2019 on multiple issues, including Venezuela. So, Douglas,